So this material will not be on exam two, but we're going to start switching from primarily focusing on stalker grazing systems to primarily focusing on confined feeding systems. I think this is kind of a fun lecture. A lot of this stuff we've already kind of really talked about, but hopefully we're going to explain it a little bit better and more in depth. And then probably my favorite two lectures will be the next two, where we'll talk about implants, ionophores, and beta agonists. So Um, this date is wrong. It's not March 4th or 2025. But okay. So today I want you guys to understand how physiological maturity impacts growth rates. Okay. So we've talked about this quite a bit, but it's extremely important. Okay. I want you to know why NEG requirements change as cattle are at different stages of physiological maturity. Spoiler alert, it is all about how much fat how much of their gain is composed by fat versus lean tissue growth. Okay. I want you to be able to define compensatory gain. Okay. A lot of people think that compensatory gain is just like the best thing ever because you have a period of really efficient cattle. Okay. I would say that it's something you want to buy, it's not something you want to create. So that's why you see a little bit of a premium on thin cattle in auction markets, right? At stockyards, thin cattle will get a little bit of a premium because they could exhibit some compensatory gain. However, most of this faster accretion rates, so faster growth rates, are occurring in non-carcass tissues, so gastrointestinal tract and liver. Okay. I want you to know the three listed feeding strategies that I provide in here for backgrounding cattle in confinement. In reality, it's a lot more complex than these three generalities that I'm coming up with. But when you're teaching, you have to kind of have to teach in generalities. There's less room for gray areas. Okay. But these are three real main feeding strategies you can implement for backgrounding cattle in confinement. And I want you to be able to use the NASM equations to estimate how much dry matter intake is required to achieve a specified level of performance with a specified diet and class of animals. Okay. So these equations are needed if we're going to do a program feeding enterprise. Okay. Where we want an animal to gain 2 pounds per head per day. Okay. We need to know how much feed we need to offer them to achieve that desired level of performance. So to do that, we have to do some calculations. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Cattle grow, most things grow in a sigmoidal growth curve. Okay. So that is this S-shaped curve. You guys known that? Okay. Sigmoidal growth curve. So here on the X, we have age. Here on the Y, we have weight. And then as animals get older, they get heavier up until maturity, and then their weight plateaus. Okay. So we have three curves here. We have a small frame, medium frame, and a large frame. The weight and age that a large frame animal will achieve maturity or USDA choice or puberty will be different or higher than a medium frame or a small frame. Okay. Does that make sense? So if we were to draw a line just at a standard weight, got a call coming, um, where a medium frame steer reaches maturity, okay, the large frame steer hasn't even reached USDA choice, hasn't even reached 28% empty body fat, okay? And the small frame steer will never reach that weight, okay? If we put a line where it falls for maturity for a small, medium, and large frame, you can see that age or weight and age increases. So a large frame steer at maturity will be heavier and older than a medium frame steer at maturity, which will be bigger than a small frame steer at maturity. Does this all make sense? Does it help to visualize this? Okay. Move this thing. I don't know where to move it though. Okay. So took this table out of the beef cattle nutrient requirements book. Okay. So we have, these are all in kilograms. So bear with me. Okay. 250 kilogram animal, 350 kilogram animal, 500 kilogram animal. Okay. That first part is NEG requirements. This middle part is protein in gain as a percent of weight gain, total weight gain. And this bottom part is fat in gain as a percent of total weight gain. Okay, what do you guys notice? These are all for a medium frame steer. Does anybody want to speak up? This thing? Turn that off. Cool. Anybody notice anything from this table? Okay, what does NEG requirements do as gain increases? Goes up. Okay. What does NEG requirements do as body weight increases? Okay. So, what does protein in gain do as body weight increases? Okay. What does fat in gain do as body weight increases? So fat increases, protein increases. So part of the reason that animal has a higher NEG requirement as it gets heavier, even if it's within the same rate of gain, is because they're depositing more fat as a proportion of their total lean tissue. Okay. Interestingly, ME utilization efficiency for fat deposition is actually higher than protein deposition. So fat deposition is more efficient on a kcal basis. However, since it's so energy dense, right, it is less efficient on a per pound basis. Does that make sense? As a rule of thumb, it takes 5 times the amount of ME intake, metabolizable energy intake, to deposit 1 pound of fat than it does 1 pound of lean tissue. Okay? Make sense? Okay. So, as rate of gain increases, even within that same animal, right, that rate of gain is increasing because they have more energy intake, right? For a 250 kilogram animal to gain 1.3 pounds a day, they would need to eat more energy than for a 250 kilogram animal to gain 0.6 pounds a day. So within each individual animal's weight class, as energy intakes, the proportion of fat in gain increases. Okay? So that's why when we grow cattle at a faster rate, they're depositing more fat. And we're actually shifting their growth curve down to where they'll reach 28% empty body fat at a lighter body weight. Does that make sense? Okay? Because once we add fat to that animal, we have shifted its growth curve. Okay? Everybody following so far? Okay. So what do I say here? So as body weight increases, protein in gain decreases, fat in gain increases. So that causes NEG required at each level of gain to increase. Okay? As rate of gain increases, protein in gain decreases, fat in gain increases, and that causes NEG required to increase at each given body weight. Okay? Okay. So, studies have looked at can I increase energy intake to increase rate of gain, but provide rumen undegradable amino acids so that I can shift more of that energy to lean tissue growth and less of that energy to fat growth? Do you think any of those studies are very effective? Do you think that strategy is an effective way to increase lean tissue growth? No. Okay. That's why we don't feed very much rumen protected amino acids in the beef industry. Okay. So, explanation. As energy intake above maintenance increases, protein synthesis rate becomes first limiting to protein accretion. So the body has a upper threshold that it can use energy for protein accretion. So when energy intake gets above that, that excess energy above that maximum threshold just gets deposited as fat. Okay? Dilutes body content of protein, ash, and water. So more fat in empty body weight means there's less percent of the body weight is going to be protein, ash, and water. These are deposited at near constant ratios of each other at a particular age. Okay? So as we're increasing fat as a percent of that animal's body weight, we're decreasing protein, ash, and water. What can that do? So if we have less ash, what would that indicate? Less ash in an animal. What would ash be an indication of? If I were to take an animal, put it through a mothing machine, grind the whole animal up, and measure ash content of that whole animal's body, what would that represent? Mineral content. Exactly. Yep. So what is the major storage of minerals in the body? Muscles. Where do we have most of our minerals in the body stored? Bones. Yeah, skeletal system. Okay. So if we're diluting protein, ash, and water, not only are we decreasing muscle, but we're decreasing skeletal bones, and so we're decreasing frame size. Does that make sense? Okay. So, in support of protein synthesis rate becoming first limiting, okay, studies done where they looked at providing ruminally protected amino acids to diets of feedlot cattle did not improve average daily gain or feed efficiency. So, protein synthesis in the peripheral tissue, so skeletal muscle, okay, is not limited by amino acid supply or transport of amino acids into muscle cells. Okay, it's limited by some physiological mechanism that puts a cap on protein synthesis rate. Okay, does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions? What that physiological mechanism is, I don't know. I don't know if we do know. Questions? Okay. All right. Switching gears a little bit. Compensatory gain. Who wants to give me a definition of compensatory gain? I think I already said it. I know we've talked about this in feeds. We're going to look at some data from Dr. Karsten's PhD, which in my opinion is one of the coolest PhD studies that has ever been done. Give me a definition of compensatory gain. Can you give me a definition of compensatory gain without reading the slides? Yep. Okay. It's on the slides, I guess. Darn it. Okay. So compensatory gain, period of faster gain So we have more efficient animals, takes less feed to deposit a unit of gain, right? Following a period of nutritional or environmental stress. So we have stressed animals that either were provided inadequate nutrition or they were experiencing some environmental stress, so maybe heat stress uh, or physiological stress that made them nutritionally undernutrition, made them undernutritioned. Is that right? Malnutritioned. Okay. Um, so that whenever we go through that amelioration period where they have that nutritional imbalance corrected, they experience faster, more efficient growth. Okay. So at 250 kilograms and a growth rate of 1.2 kilograms per day, a medium frame calf would require 4.28 megacows of NEG per day, whereas a medium frame yearling would require 3.78 megacows of NEG per day. So obviously, this calf, which is about 500 pounds, okay, probably weaned at 500 pounds, didn't really experience a period of malnutrition. However, this yearling is a year old and weighs the same amount as a calf, probably went through a period of malnutrition. Okay. And because of that, they require less NEG than the calf at the same rate of gain. Okay. So the more efficient energy utilization is accounted for three main reasons. And we'll look at some data that's going to support these. Okay. A decreased maintenance energy requirement, likely to due to smaller gastrointestinal tracts and smaller livers. Okay. You have an animal that's not eating much and is malnutritioned, they're going to have lower gut mass, right? Because gut mass is really driven by level of intake in cattle. Okay. And then they have less metabolic activity going on in the liver. So they're going to have smaller livers. Those are the two main drivers of maintenance energy requirements of animals. Tissue turnover in the gastrointestinal tract, and then metabolic activity in the liver. Okay. Two, they could have increased dry matter intake relative to younger cattle at the same body weight. An older animal will always eat more than a younger animal at the same body weight. Okay. Three, they'll have a decreased NEG requirement. So more gain is going to go toward protein synthesis than fat. So this added protein synthesis does not occur in skeletal muscle. We'll look at some of this data from Dr. Karstens. Most of this added protein synthesis is happening in non-carcass tissues, non-carcass protein. Okay. As promised, Dr. Karstens, 1999, 1991. Bang. Okay. Quantified carcass and non-carcass tissue growth by serial slaughter. Okay. So he took a group of animals, slaughtered them at the beginning of the study, measured body composition, and then took them through different feeding strategies for, what did he do? Compensatory growth group, they were restricted to only gain 0.88 pounds per day for 6 months. Okay. So if they even had a compensatory growth group with slower rates of gain than that, these results could be further exacerbated. So keep that in mind. They restricted growth when the animal weighed from 540 pounds to 717 pounds. Okay, so they had, what is that? A little under 200 pounds of growth at a real slow growth rate. Okay. Then they fed a continuous growth control. And so they had a control group of animals that were not restricted in their rate of gain during that initial feeding period. Okay. And they took that control and the compensatory growth treatment until they harvested them at 1,100 pounds. So they have body composition data at the start of the study, then body composition data at the end of the study, and they looked at that change in protein, fat, ash, and water in different tissues. Okay, to see where is that period of increased growth rate happening tissue at the tissue level. Yeah. Okay. So serial slaughter is an experimental approach where you do just what I explained. You have groups of animals that are assigned different harvest dates within the study. And so the theory is that those animals that were slaughtered at the start of the study are representative of the whole group. And those animals that are slaughtered at the end of the study are representative of the whole group. Okay. So serial slaughter is where you assign animals to be slaughtered at specific dates serially. Yeah. So they did a lot of this work recently at WT, and they looked at extending days on feed. I think they actually did some beta agonist work with this too, and implants, but still used today. Not really going to be slaughtering 540-pound animals today because it costs so much darn money, right? What would like $5 a hundredweight or more for a 500-pound animal? So if you slaughtered 20, that's a lot of money. So most serial slaughter studies being done today are happening in the finishing period, and they're just looking at if I harvest them at 150 days versus 170 versus 190 versus 210, right? So they're not losing as much money on these types of research. Okay. Okay. During that period where they were not restricting growth from 717 pounds to 1,100 pounds, the control gained 2.56 pounds per day. Okay. The compensatory growth guys gained 3.4. And so when you have animals that go through a period of malnutrition and then that malnutrition gets alleviated, that's called realimentation. Okay. So realimentation refers to the period where nutrient restrictions are alleviated. This result, where these slow-grown cattle had faster rate of gain during the finishing period relative to the control, kind of really fits our compensatory growth model, right? We have animals that are more efficient after they are realimented. Okay. Questions so far? Okay. All right. So prior to realimentation, the control or compensatory growth steers had 23.8 pounds less gastrointestinal tract than the control steers. Okay. So you can express that as 23.8 divided by 717 would give you what percent of the gastrointestinal tract difference was on their body weight, right? So that's kind of appreciable. At 1,100 pounds, so their final body weight, the compensatory growth steers had 19.4 more GIT fill than the control. So that ranking switched. That's because those compensatory growth cattle ate more feed during realimentation. Okay. No differences in accretive rates, so tissue growth rates for carcass chemical components. Okay. Accretive rates were greater for the compensatory growth steers for non-carcass protein, non-carcass water, and empty body protein. Okay. Compensatory growth had lower empty body fat, greater empty body protein, resulted in 18% lower NEG requirements than the control steers. So you know what a carcass is? So the chemical components of that carcass, so protein, fat, ash, water. Okay. So steers, compensatory growth steers were leaner, so they're depositing less fat in their gain, required 18% less NEG. Compensatory growth steers But most of that lean tissue growth was not coming from carcass tissues. Okay. Any questions? Okay. We've seen this before, but under this new context, just wanted to point this out again. So here we have an early wean treatment. So they're weaned at 3.5 months. A normal wean treatment, they're weaned at 8 months of age. These two treatments went straight into the feed yard, put on a high finishing concentrate based diet, high energy finishing diet. These three treatments were grown either on wheat, intensive early stocked on native range, or season long stocked on native range. Okay. So you can see the age of these animals at feedlot entry. So they entered the feedlot right after their early weaning of less than 4 months old. They entered right at weaning at 7.9 months. These guys, wheat, 12, 15, and then 17. Okay. So really light body weights at feedlot entry. Feedlot entry body weights were right at their weaning weight, right? 540 pounds. Grown on wheat were 765, 850, 920. Okay. So obviously, lighter cattle are going to require more days on feed, right? Because they need longer to gain that more weight. Make sense? Okay. So in body weight was less for these cattle that weren't grown at a slow rate of gain in pasture systems compared to these that were. Okay. So we went over this maybe last lecture, I think already. But in essence, you can get cattle to a heavier final body weight by having a period of relatively slow rates of growth so that they can have more lean tissue, right, at feedlot entry, and so they'll be more feed efficient. Okay. All right. Here is average daily gain. These guys had the worst performance. These guys were higher, the wheat pasture guys. These guys were, I don't know, I guess lower than that. Okay. This is their average feedlot body weight. This is their feed intake. Okay. So those that were just placed into a feedlot had lower dry matter intake than those that experienced a growing period. Younger cattle just do not have the capacity to consume feed when they're placed into feedlots at a younger age than those that experienced a growing phase. Okay. Uh, okay. These guys have a better feed to gain, so they were more feed efficient. Okay. But keep in mind, these guys had a higher average body weight. Okay. Oh, also, just point out once again that season long stocked cattle had a lower average daily gain than intensive early stocked cattle. And if we remember back from our previous lecture, that's largely driven by gastrointestinal tract mass and that increasing their net energy for maintenance requirements. Okay. Okay, those that did not experience a growing phase had lighter hot carcass weights. They were much more fat. These are the only two treatments that would have graded choice or higher. Okay. So I actually showed the table in the previous lecture where I calculated adjusted final body weight, just estimate what their body weight would be at an equivalent endpoint of 28% empty body fat. And these guys that were grown had a much higher adjusted final body weight than these that did not have a growing period. Okay. So hopefully that kind of shows again why a period of slower growth, why having a background slash stalker phase is important. It allows us to produce more beef per head, so it just makes the whole system more efficient. Okay. So the backgrounding process is a process of growing cattle at targeted rates of gain to add frame and muscling. Okay. Targeted average daily gain can vary widely. So can range from 1.5 to 3 pounds per day, depending on that operation and what their specific goals are. And you see a big range, geographic difference. High plains feed yards will have a faster rate of gain in the backgrounding phase than Midwestern feed yards. Midwestern cattle are higher quality. Okay, so they want to grow them at a slower growth rate so they can really have a true lean animal starting on feed at 900 pounds so they can finish them at 1,600 pounds plus. Okay. All right. So um, the goal is to produce an 800 to 900 pound steer that we can transition to a finishing diet. So a high energy diet. Okay. Really, three ways we can do this. Okay. One, I'm going to say is typical. All right. That's where we're going to feed cattle higher roughage diets so that are lower in energy. We're going to follow a slick bunk protocol. So slick bunk is close to ad libitum. So that's targeting where the bunk is slick. There's no feed left at the next feeding. Okay. Uh, so management protocol. So we don't really want to restrict intake of these animals. We just formulated a ration that has lower energy content so that their maximum voluntary feed intake, they are gaining 2 pounds a day. Okay, so I'm going to call that typical. Next, limit feeding. That's feeding cattle higher concentrate diets, so high energy diets, where dry matter intake is delivered at a target. Okay, so this could be, maybe we formulate a ration where that animal will gain 2 pounds a day if we feed them 80 to 90% of ad lib. Okay, but we will feed the amount of dry matter intake required by that group of animals to achieve our targeted average daily gain. Okay. Next could be program feeding. So feeding a higher energy diet. So that could be medium to high energy. And we're going to target a certain average daily gain. Okay. Key distinct difference. Limit feeding, our goal is a certain amount of dry matter intake. Program feeding, our goal is a certain amount of average daily gain. So all program feeding is limit feeding, but not all limit feeding is program feeding. Does that make sense? Yeah, targeting a certain average daily gain. So we would do, let's say, um, we know what that animal weighed at the start of the feeding period. We're going to feed them, deliver to them the amount of dry matter intake needed to add 2 pounds a day, so that at the next 7 days, we'll adjust that dry matter intake based off their new body weight to achieve 2 pounds a day. Okay, compared to limit feeding, which is we are just going to restrict the amount of feed we're delivering to a certain threshold built around intake. So one's driven by our target is gain, one's driven by our target is dry matter intake. Okay. Um, so some things you need to consider. Okay. If you're limit feeding or program feeding, where we're restricting intake, we're going to have cattle that are hungrier, right? Because we're not allowing them to eat to satiety. Okay. So we need to allow more animals to gain access to the bunk at the same time. Okay. So we may need to add more linear bunk space. So many inches of bunk space per head. Why would we want to do that? Yeah. So they're hungrier. We don't want one bully to go up there and get a big slug compared to a more timid animal, right? That could cause some gastrointestinal problems, um, could cause more variation in average daily gain within the pen, where you have one animal that's eating less because it's more timid, one animal that's eating more because they're more aggressive. Okay. Um, so I say that there. So this could theoretically increase within pen variation in average daily gain so that by the end of the feeding period, into the growing period, we'd have a wide range in final body weights is the potential. Okay. You also have hungrier animals, so you probably need better bunk lines. Otherwise, they'll crawl through the bunk lines. You need to have better trained staff who are more dialed in on loading ingredients into the mixer, who are more dialed in on delivering the appropriate amount of feed to the bunk each day. Make sense? So there's a lot more logistic challenges around that. Also, typical feeding, where we're going to feed near ad libitum of a high roughage diet, that allows these producers to feed more of their homegrown ingredients, right? So a lot of people will feed a higher roughage diet because they can feed in Southwest Oklahoma more wheatlage, which is a lower cost to them because they grew it themselves, as opposed to more concentrate that they had to buy in. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So program feeding is a strategy that grows cattle at targeted rates of gain using limited amounts of a moderate to high concentrate diet. Again, all program feeding is limit feeding, but not all limit feeding is program feeding. So you can use the net energy equations to calculate the amounts of feed required for maintenance and the desired rate of gain. And then you can adjust your feed delivery based off of that animal's body weight at that time, because as animals get heavier, their NEG requirements goes up, their NEM requirements goes up, so it takes more pounds of feed to achieve that same level of gain. Make sense? Okay. Um, okay. If we are restricting feed intake, we will typically need to feed greater concentrations of other nutrients to meet the requirements. So the amount of protein needed to support 2 pounds of gain is not going to change whether that animal is eating 23 pounds of dry matter a day or 12, right? But the concentration of that protein within those two diets needs to be higher for the one that is eating less. We'll look at some examples of that. Okay, so this is the NEG equation. We went over this in our first lab. Okay, so we'll have a little bit of a review. All right, this equation uses the same original equation that was developed in 1984. However, instead of adjusting the coefficients based off frame size and class of animal, heifer versus steer or bull, right? Um, so that old equation would adjust from 13.91 to 15.54 to 17.35 there. However, now we're going to use equivalent trunk body weight as that adjustment factor for frame size of animal and body weight as a proportion of their final body weight at 28% empty body fat. Does that make sense? Okay. So shrunk weight gain is equal to 13.91 times NEG. And so that is megacals of NEG intake that is available for them to use as gain. Okay. To the 0.9116 times equivalent shrunk body weight raised to the negative 0.6837. Equivalent shrunk body weight, we calculate that as the average shrunk body weight within each feeding period that we have of interest, okay, times standard reference weight. So standard reference weight is based off of the weight of the animals that were used to develop the equations. Okay. And they have a different standard reference weight based off the empty body fat. So 435 kilograms at 25% empty body fat, 462 at 26.8, and then 478 at 28% empty body fat. So remember, this is choice. This would be like select, and then this would be standard quality grade. So as an example, we buy a 700-pound steer, so that's 317.5 kilograms. Anticipated final body weight is 1,500, so that's 680.3 kilograms. So equivalent trunk body weight, 317.5. So this would be equivalent trunk body weight at the start of the feeding period. So 317.5 times 0.96, because we need to take this live weight to shrunk weight, times standard reference weight divided by the final body weight at 28% empty body fat times 0.96. So that equals 304.8 times 0.73, which is these things. The 0.73 is equal to that. Okay. And that's going to equal 223 kilograms. So that animal's equivalent trunk body weight is 223 kilograms. Okay. All right. So NEG required, how much NEG is needed for a given body weight gain is equal to 0.0635 times empty body weight to the 3/4 power. So empty metabolic body weight times empty body gain to the 1.097 power. Empty body weight is calculated as 0.891 times shrunk body weight. Shrunk body weight is calculated as 0.96 times body weight. Empty body gain is 0.956 times shrunk weight gain, and shrunk weight gain is 0.96 times average daily gain. I will give you all these equations. Okay? Cool. So, some disadvantages of program feeding / limit feeding. We talked about some of these. Basically, it requires additional facilities and additional management. Okay, we have higher feed cost on a dollar per pound or dollar per ton basis because we have to buy in more purchased ingredients because we're feeding more concentrates. Okay, we're going to need better bunk line cables to keep cattle from climbing over the bunk and escaping, trying to find food because they're hungry. Okay. We need skill on the part of the manager, right, to make sure that everybody else is doing their job. We need skill from the part of the employees. They need to be better at more accurately mixing and delivering the feed, right, because we're dealing with higher energy diets that have more risk associated to the animal. Okay. They need to have business management skills to evaluate the economic limitations and opportunities in limit feeding cattle. So they need to assess the dollar trade-off between ration cost and improved feed efficiency. So is it really going to make them more money to offset that additional feed cost? Okay. Need to have adequate bunk space so that most cattle can eat at the bunk around the same time. Need to have pens that are small enough so that cattle are more willing to come to the bunk when fed. You don't want cattle loafing at the back of a large pen when the feed truck gets delivered because those hungry cattle in their pen with them may eat their share of the feed. That makes sense? Okay. You have potentially greater risks due to digestive upsets. Okay. Cattle will have a lower ruminal pH because they're eating a higher energy diet. Okay. So what if an aggressive steer consumes a large amount of feed compared to the more timid steer just on one day? How can that lead to ruminal acidosis and then ultimately greater incidence of liver abscesses? Okay. Potentially, you could have more variation within pen variation and dry matter intake. More aggressive cattle could eat more than more timid cattle. That's going to drive more within pen variation and average daily gain, which will lead to more within pen variation in final body weight. Okay, why might that be bad? Absolutely. They want to feed a group of animals that will have the similar body composition at their targeted endpoint so they can harvest all those animals at the same time and not have some that are grading standard, some that are grading prime, right? They would rather target have a group of more uniform cattle that they can feed for, you know, to 1,500 pounds, and all those animals will grade kind of average choice, right? Um, so potential for lower margins for custom feeding. So if I'm a backgrounder and someone is paying me to feed their own cattle, I have less ability to add markup to the feeds that I've grown, right? Does that make sense? So if I am a custom feeder and I grow my own roughages, like my own silage, okay, I can charge a fixed cost markup to that ingredient to the my client, right? If I'm buying in commodities, the ability for me to add margin to that feed to have fixed cost feed markup is much less. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. Advantages. Okay. Potentially lower costs of gain. Okay. If feed efficiency, so feed to gain, is reduced enough to offset that additional feed cost of buying in ingredients. Okay. You require less volume of feed, right? You deliver less feed to cattle each day because you're feeding them less. So that could have benefits around less trips to deliver feed to the cattle with a feed truck, right? Less commodity storage. Maybe I don't have to buy as large of a commodity barn. Then less time spent loading and mixing rations. Obviously, the more you're feeding, the longer it's going to take you to drive your payloader, scoop feed up, and then add it to your mixing wagon. Okay. Less commodity shrinkage. Okay. So commodity shrinkage is loss of pounds that you paid for to the environment. The big commodity shrinkage comes from water loss. So I buy or I have a wet commodity, and just from the ambient temperature, it dries out a little bit. We're buying these feed on an as-fed basis so that if it dries out, we've lost money that we paid for. Does that make sense? What could be another uh, cause of shrink, ingredient shrink? What could cause feed to be lost to the environment? Weather? Yeah. What about dust? Dust is a big one. Spoilage, cattle in the bunk, uh, wasting feed. Okay. So all those things are going to decrease your feed efficiency because they have less of that feed that they're actually consuming to convert into sellable weight. Okay. Um, so if we do a program feeding where we're feeding more concentrates, typically roughages will have higher ingredient shrinkage than concentrates. Okay. Dry roughages are really dusty. So you can lose as much as 10% of haze that you buy in because during grinding and loading into the mixer wagon from dust. Okay. So roughages typically will have greater shrinkage than concentrates. So importantly, cost of gain in program fed cattle, limit fed cattle will only be uh, lower if that improvement in feed efficiency offsets the cost of buying external ingredients. Does that all make sense to you guys? Any questions on this? Okay. So I probably, if I was going to ask a question around advantages and disadvantage, I would ask maybe 4 of each. Okay. I wouldn't expect you guys to rewrite that last slide or the slide before that, which was a lot. Okay. All right. Let's look at an example of needing to increase nutrient content by limit feeding. Okay. So just to set the stage, I have a 750-pound initial body weight. Final body weight's 900 pounds. I want to feed them for 75 days, targeting an average daily gain of 2 pounds per day. This diet NEG to achieve that targeted rate of gain is 38 megacals per hundredweight for a traditional system, or 55 megacals per hundredweight for a limit fed system. So you can see that that energy increased by 17 megacals of NEG per hundredweight, going from a typical system to a limit fed. Okay. Just to set a stage or put this in perspective, the typical recommended NEG content of a finishing ration is around 64. Okay. Which, as a rule of thumb, if you add 30 megacals to NEG, that'll get you within 1 to 2 megacals for NEM. So a 64 megacal NEG diet is 94 megacals NEM per hundredweight. Does that make sense? That gets you close, well within the ballpark. Okay. So to mix these, I go on calculator, use prairie hay, mature, sweet bran, steam flake corn, and then minerals to meet mineral requirements. Okay. So here is a diet: 61% dry matter prairie hay, 28.5% sweet bran, 9% corn grain, steam flake corn, 1.3% limestone, 0.2% sodium chloride, so salt, something so small for cobalt it's not even registering, and then 0.02 for copper sulfate. As you can see, all these are adequate. Projected average daily gain is 2.01. My desired was 2. This animal is going to consume 19.5 pounds of dry matter. We'll have a feed to gain of 9.7. Okay. So it takes 9.7 pounds of feed to add 1 pound of gain. Okay. So diet targeting 2 pounds per day at ad libitum intake. So predicted intake is 19.5. Cattle would require 1.96 pounds of crude protein per day. Okay. So to meet this requirement, we only needed to have a protein concentration in the diet of 10.3% crude protein. Does that make sense? My NEM is 65, my NEG is 38. Okay. So here, formulated this ration to be 55 megacals of NEG. So now we're only 25% prairie hay. Before we were 61. Now we're 37.8% sweet bran. Before we were 28.5, so almost went up 10 percentage units in sweet bran. Corn grain is now 35.5% of dry matter. Before it was 9. Okay. 1.5% limestone, 0.2 salt. So our minerals really didn't change. Now this animal is predicted to eat 18.8. So if we fed ad libitum this higher NEG diet, our projected average daily gain is 3.22. So if we just turn them loose on this higher NEG diet, we're going to far outpace our desired targeted rate of gain in this backgrounding system. Okay. If we fed this diet to cattle ad libitum, they would gain 3.22 pounds per day. They would require 2.47 pounds of crude protein per day, and we were able to achieve this with 13.1% crude protein. Okay? So if we want to use this diet and feed them to gain 2 pounds per day, we would need to restrict or limit feed or program feed this ration. We could not just let them eat what they want. What I got, 17 minutes? Cool. All right, so this is the same ration. Predicted feed intake is still 18.8. However, to achieve that our desired average daily gain, I would need to feed them 14.2 pounds per day. What do you notice about feed to gain? Went way down, right? My feed to gain is now 7.1. So it took 2 pounds less feed to gain 1 pound of dry matter than our typical lower energy diet. Does that make sense? Okay. NEG is 55, NEM is 84. So to achieve our targeted 2 pounds per day average daily gain, we would need to limit feed these animals 14.2 pounds per day. Cattle still have 1.96 pounds of crude protein requirement to achieve that 2 pounds per day. Okay. If I did not change anything else, we are now deficient in crude protein. Okay. So a 13.1% crude protein diet and a limit fed ration in this example is deficient in crude protein. Where before at 13.1% crude protein, when our typical ad libitum scenario that we first looked at, we were able to meet crude protein requirements at 10. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is that previous diet, except now we've added urea. We added 0.25% of dry matter as urea for non-protein nitrogen. It's kept intake the same. Projected average daily gain is still 2. We're now adequate in crude protein, but to meet that crude protein requirement to gain 2 pounds per day, we needed to feed a diet that is 13.8% crude protein. Does that make sense? Compared to the ad libitum that we first looked at, which we met that 1.96 pounds per day of crude protein requirement with 10%. So as we restrict intake, the concentrations of other nutrients need to be increased. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So now we're going to move on to looking at some of the studies that looked at bunk space allocation. Okay. This one is a paper from, gosh, I think the 70s. Bob Lake out of Guyman, Oklahoma, did a study at hitch feeders. I don't think they're hitch feeders anymore. I think the hitch family sold out like 5 years ago, maybe. But okay, they compared limit feeding cattle with 9 inches of linear bunk space per head compared to 12 inches of linear bunk space per head. So they saw no difference in performance. So they stated that 9 inches per head, 55% of cattle could eat at one time. At 12 inches per head, 75% of cattle could eat at one time. So this would suggest maybe you don't need to increase linear bunk space. But they just reported pin averages on average daily gain. They didn't necessarily look at the variation within pin variation and gain. Okay. Any questions on this study? Making a face? No. Cool. All right. More recent paper. Okay. Spore in 2019 fed 354 heifers. Their initial body weight was 472 pounds. So they had 11 to 12 heifers per pin. They fed them either a 45, 50, 55, or 60 megacal per hundredweight diet, and they targeted 2.2 pounds of average daily gain per day. So obviously, as you're increasing energy concentration of the diet, the amount of dry matter that you're feeding them is going to have to go down to achieve that 2.2 pounds per day. Okay. They allocated into pins with, I don't know what I'm saying here, but they allocated them into pins with right around 30 inches of bunk space per head. Okay. As energy concentration increases, they're 45, 50, 55, 60. Those are megacows of NEG. You can see the different diets. So here we have alfalfa hay, prairie hay, dry rolled corn, sweet bran, and then their vitamin mineral premix. Okay. And then this shows you the nutrient concentrations. Okay. So as you go up in energy concentration of the diet, you're decreasing the amount of hay you're feeding, you're increasing the amount of dry rolled corn, and they kept sweet bran the same at 40. So that added energy is coming from feeding more corn. Okay. Uh, so they looked at initial body weight, final body weight, average daily gain. Here on these lower energy diets, they were unable to achieve their target by 0.04 pounds per day, but got close. This one, they were right at target. Here at this 60, this highest energy diet, they were 0.2 pounds, so almost a quarter pound per head per day over their desired average daily gain. Why might that be? Are they just bad at feeding cattle? Were these cattle more efficient than they thought they would be? Or that the NASA models would suggest? Why might that be? What happens to gastrointestinal tract if you're reducing intake? Going to get smaller. They probably had lower energy requirements because less protein turnover in the gastrointestinal tract, is my suspicion. Okay. Here, this shows you their dry matter intake. So they reduced intake by about, I don't know, 0.9 there, or 11, no, 1.1. I don't want to do all that math. Okay. So as energy intake increased, they reduced dry matter intake. And then also as energy concentration of the diet increased, these animals are eating less, gaining close to the same amount of average daily gain, so that feed to gain is decreasing. They reported no impact on health, ruminal pH declined, but saw no adverse health impact. So more energy concentrated diets reduce ruminal pH. Okay, feeding more starch is going to suppress ruminal pH. Okay, so their conclusion was that a high energy diet can be limit fed to backgrounding cattle. Okay, so what is, but they kept linear bunk space the same, and they had 30 inches of linear bunk space per head, which is ridiculous. I think industry standard somewhere 9 to 12. More linear bunk space in the winter than in the summer. Why might that be? In the winter, we have poor pen conditions, so we need less stock density within the pen. Okay. All right. Here's another study. They fed 332 heifers, allocated pens with 18 to 28 head per bunk or per pen. Linear bunk space increased from 6, 10, 14 to 18. Fed them for 56 days at a target of 2% of body weight. So they were targeting a certain amount of feed delivered per body weight. What type of backgrounding feed management is this? Someone said the second one, limit feeding, right? Before they were targeting 2.2 pounds per day. So that would be program feeding. Okay. So this diet that they fed was right around 59 megacows of NEG per hundredweight. And so this is based off of not actually analyzing the diet, but using the feed library, just like you guys would have done in feeds, right? You just had a printed table that told you what the concentration of these ingredients should be. And so that is not analyzed energy, that is just tabular. Okay. Okay. They saw no effect of bunk space allotment on morbidity, final body weight, average daily gain. So their average daily gain was on average 2.34 pounds a day. No effect on bunk space allotment on the standard deviation of average daily gain within pen. Okay. So it averaged 0.69 kilograms per day. No effect on dry matter intake or feed to gain. Okay. Suggested that although reducing bunk space allocation decreases the number of head that can eat at a given time, which shows this here. So at 6 inches per head, only 43% could eat at one time, compared to 18 inches per head, 96%. So most of the pen had space to go up there and eat at the same time. So they suggested that more aggressive cattle eat first, consume their initial meal, then they yield the bunk space to the more timid cattle, and they suggest that their results indicate that cattle were able to eat close to their targeted feed allocation even within pen because they had a kind of a small and non-different standard deviation of average daily gain within pen. So do we think that this means linear bunk space is not important? We've seen 2 studies now that have reported that. I don't know. My suspicion is these were done at a research farm with 30 head pens. There's not very many commercial feedlots with 30 head pens. And then my thought is, why take that risk, right? To have a train wreck on your hand. I would still recommend increasing linear bunk space allocation if you're going to restrict feed intake to cattle. Okay. So those were the main flaws of the study, done in a research environment, not necessarily going to be applicable, comparing a 30 head pen and the dynamics that are happening in there compared to a 100 head pen to 300 head pen in a commercial environment. Does that make sense? My thoughts. Okay. So small replicated pens with only 18 to 28 head each. Will these results translate to our commercial sized pens? They allocated feed based off of a percent of body weight. Okay. They weighed cattle weekly to adjust feed calls. Or will a producer weigh their cattle weekly? No, they're not going to weigh their cattle weekly. Okay. So how can they really implement this same approach? Okay. These diets are high in byproduct. So they were feeding all diets 40% sweet bran. Okay. Would these, and the energy content is still relatively high at 60 NEG, but wet corn gluten feed has 91% of the NEG value of steam flake corn, but most of that energy in sweet bran, which is corn gluten feed, most of that energy in sweet bran is coming from fiber and negligible starch. So if I were to replicate this study and I increased or reduced byproduct feeds and I increased grain, would it be a different story? I don't know. Okay, I think I said all that. Okay, so what is most typical for backgrounding? Talked with Jarrett, my buddy. He said most producers are not truly program feeding. Okay, so they're not feeding cattle a reduced dry matter intake to achieve a desired level of average daily gain. They will limit dry matter intake to 2.6% of body weight, so they will set a ceiling on dry matter intake of cattle. But they will range that ceiling from 2.5 to 2.7%. They are not limit feeding high energy diets. Okay. All grow yards aim to keep their feed costs down by producing their own forage. And that cheaper ingredient that they grow in-house, they're going to want to maximize its utilization. Okay. Midwest diets are typically corn silage, silage, corn stalks, and hay, or hay, corn products or corn co-products, so corn gluten, modified distillers, soybean hulls. Currently are pricing into rations today because they just opened up some new soybean oil plants in South Dakota. Okay. They'll feed dry rolled or high moisture corn as needed. Some won't feed any additional corn above what's already contained in their silage. Some will. They're typically feeding 48 to 52 NEG diets that are 14.5 to 16% crude protein And in the Midwest, they're targeting 1.8 to 2 pounds per day. Okay? Compare that to Oklahoma, Texas. Diets are typically sorghum silage, wheatledge, hay, corn stalks. We're out of the corn belt. We're in a drier climate. We need more drought tolerant species. They will feed dry rolled corn, dry distillers. They're typically feeding 48 to 55 NEG per hundredweight. So within that same range, but the upward limit is a little higher. Similar crude protein to the Midwest. They will feed higher crude protein for lighter cattle because they have lower intakes. And so they need more concentrated crude protein in their ration to reach their absolute pounds per day requirement. Okay. And they're targeting 2.5 to 2.7 pounds per day. And this range could be even wider. So I think we already talked about why Midwest cattle will typically be fed at a lower growth rate than Southern Plains. They're just a higher quality cattle. And they want a really lean animal to enter the finishing diet or to be started fed the finishing diet so they can maximize their endpoint body weight. Okay. All right. I think that's time. Hmm. You guys can go through that. Well, we may actually pick back up. Okay. You guys are good to go. Class ends at 11:20, right? Okay. Usually everybody's like chipping at the bit to get out of here.